Hi, today we celebrate Martin Luther King's birthday. There's a lot to remember. There's a lot to think about in terms of celebrating Dr. King's birthday. You know, it was not easy getting this day passed as a national holiday. And I remember Coretta Scott King, his widow, who herself has now passed. Also, I remember Stevie Wonder being very involved. A lot of celebrities, a lot of lawmakers. It took a long time. There was a lot of resistance to making Dr. King's birthday a national holiday. And since it has been declared a national holiday, you can really understand why the importance. And why the importance is that on this day we remember, on this day we reflect. You know, a lot of people have made his birthday about a day of national service. I've seen a lot of leaders say, oh, in honor of Dr. King's birthday, we should have national service. Well, on one hand, I think we should have national service to those less fortunate than ourselves on every day. But I think this day, in terms of it being Dr. King's birthday celebration, should be more than that. Dr. King was about more than service. He was about change. He was about transformation. He was about the courage it takes to resist forces of limitation and oppression and injustice. Let's not whitewash what happened there. Let's be real about what happened there, and let's never forget what happened there. I was 16 years old when Dr. King was assassinated, so I was old enough to have some sense of what had happened. I remember I was watching television. My mother was making dinner. I was in the den, and the television was on, and breaking news came in. And in those days, breaking news meant something. Today, breaking news means Justin Bieber had a, you know, DWI or something like that. In those days, breaking news meant, oh my God, breaking news. And the breaking news was that Dr. King had been assassinated. My mother, I told my mother, or my mother heard it. She walked into the den. Her face looked stricken. And a few minutes later, my father walked in. He would always walk in through the, we called it the utility room. Sometimes people call it the mud room. He walked in, and I ran up to him, Daddy, Daddy, Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr. has been assassinated. And I'll never forget the look on my father's face. He looked out into the distance and he went, those bastards. And I remember thinking, who? Does he know who killed him? And of course my father didn't know who specifically had killed him, but he knew who those bastards were. He knew the forces that Dr. King had challenged, and he knew the forces that were, at least in some way, responsible for his death. Dr. King was born in January of 1929, and he was assassinated in April of 1968. It was in 1955 that Rosa Parks, who I also had the honor of meeting sometime early in 2000-something, she refused to get up. She was one of the thousands and thousands and thousands, if not more, of African Americans who were told that they had to sit at the back of the bus. They had to sit at the back of the bus, and I think they also couldn't sit at all if there were white people who would rather have the seat. This, of course, was part of segregation, which was institutionalized white supremacy. You see, slavery existed in this country from 1619, when the first slave ships were brought over, until the end of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery through constitutional amendment. After that, the federal troops were stationed in the South to ensure that slavery would not be reconstituted. They were there until 1877. In 1877, the federal troops left, and at that point, the Southern legislatures, because at that point, the Southerners, having lost the Civil War, were just holding their breaths. The Southerners at that time, this was a very different South, were holding their breath until the federal troops left, and then in a certain way, all hell broke loose. The Southern legislatures passed what were called Black Code laws. Black Code laws institutionalized white supremacy in the American South. That institutionalization was called segregation. Part of segregation, among many other ways, that black people were, it was a guarantee that black people would have subpar political opportunity, social opportunity, and economic opportunity. Part of that was blacks had to sit in the back of the bus. In 1955, Rosa Parks chose a seat that wasn't at the back of the bus. And when a bus driver told her to get up, she very famously said, no. I had the honor of asking her many years later, what was that inspiration within you? What made you not get up? And I'm sure so many people had asked her that question. And her response to me, as I'm sure it was to many people, was, I was tired. And I'm sure she meant not only tired physically that day, but she was just tired. Black people were tired. You know how they say in AA, sick and tired of being sick and tired. Enough was enough. After that, Rosa Parks refusing to get up, there followed that a very, very famous chapter of American history called the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And the Montgomery Bus Boycott had to do with thousands of black people who simply walked to work every day. They refused to use the buses. And the boycott of the bus company is what led to the Supreme Court decision that ultimately dismantled segregation. Dr. King himself had been a Baptist preacher. He was a Baptist preacher, and I've read pretty much every biography of Martin Luther King that I've ever gotten my hands on. And I remember they all talk about how on the third Sunday of 1960, I believe it was, Dr. King went from being a preacher who talked a lot about political issues to a political movement leader whose work was based on his spiritual and his religious beliefs. That was the civil rights movement in the United States. Because not only did you have the 250 years of slavery, but then after that, you've got 1865 until 1965, another 100 years of institutionalized white supremacy that kept black people down, even not if enslaved, as they had been before the Civil War. Very much kept into a lower social, political, and economic condition. In 1965, because of the work of Dr. King, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Civil Rights Movement, in 1965, Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which dismantled segregation, and the year after that, signed the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act also very, very important because not only did they need to dismantle segregation, but they needed the Voting Rights Act in order to ensure that black people would have equal access to the polls. That's a particularly significant issue today because in 2013, the John Roberts-led Supreme Court began chipping away at the Voting Rights Act. If you've wondered where did all these voter suppression efforts come from, things that are going on right now in Georgia and Wisconsin and places around the country. The fact that these voter suppression efforts are legal, or at least deemed legal in some places, is because of the chipping away at the Voting Rights Act. You know, when this decision came down in the Supreme Court in 2013, whereby they did chip away at the Voting Rights Act, John Roberts, in writing the majority decision, said that they could afford to do that now because the South was different and these things wouldn't be happening anymore. And in all fairness to the South isn't the only place where they're happening now. But it's significant to read about this because Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in her dissent, put it like this. Wait a minute, it was raining and we built a really good umbrella. You're saying if we can stop using the umbrella now because nobody's getting wet. She said, that doesn't mean it stopped raining. As soon as we take our umbrellas down, it will start raining again. And that is exactly what has happened. That fact speaks to the issue of the continuation of the legacies of racism and the legacies, really legacies of slavery that are still with us today. You had the end of slavery. You had the Civil Rights Act, the abolition in 1865, then you had the Civil Rights Act in 1965. Segregation has been dismantled, slavery was ended. But it is significant that we as Americans realize that the dream of full actualization of racial equality in the United States has not yet been totally realized. And I've spoken before, and it's important that we all continue to remember that the journey continues. Right now, we have various examples, not only where the dream has not yet been realized, but where we're actually sliding backwards in terms of racial equality in the United States. Mass incarceration is an example of racial inequality and disparity. Disparity in sentencing and police treatment regarding people of color, black people specifically, is an example of us sliding backwards. And of course, the conversation has now been brought forth, and we must continue to bring it forth, about paying reparations for slavery. All of this, I believe, is the greatest way that we honor Dr. King, is by continuing his work. You know, myself as someone, like I said, I was 16 years old when he was assassinated, and that same year Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. 16 years old is old enough to really be aware of what's going on. And I've often thought about the fact that with most people who you love who died, every year it gets easier. But there has been a way with the assassinations of John Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, in which every year it gets harder. Because all the things that we feared would happen have happened. When those voices were silenced, too many voices were silenced. And that's why it's so important that we be silent no longer. It has occurred to me with Bobby Kennedy and with Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King, remember, he was born in 1929, so he would be 91 years old today. So even if Dr. King had lived, it would be time to say, Martin, you rest, and we'll take it from here. And that's what we must do. But in taking it from here, let's not forget, Dr. King was about nonviolence. Dr. King had gone to India. He studied the philosophy of political nonviolence as articulated by Mahatma Gandhi, and he brought those principles back for application to the struggle for civil rights in the United States in the 1960s. And the philosophy of nonviolence has to do with the inner light that the Quakers spoke of, that Thoreau talked about, both of which then influenced Gandhi, and then Gandhi spoke about the light which is within us, within every man, woman, and child, he said. And he said that that was the key, not only to solving our personal relationships, but also the key to solving all political and economic relationships as well. There's a lot of conversation, certainly with what I went through and a recent experience that we all know about, where spirituality should have nothing to do with politics. That's really what is whether it has to do with the fact that the evangelicals in New Hampshire, out of the evangelical voices sprang abolition. Many of the leaders of the suffragette movement were Quakers, and of course Dr. King was a preacher. Southern Christian Leadership Conference, it has always been in the great movement and unfolding of civil rights in our country. These major impulses have arisen from religious and spiritual circles. Why? Because they are the voice of conscience. Dr. King said what we need is a coalition of conscience. Dr. King, like Gandhi, spoke of the inner activation. Dr. King said that the political externalization, he said that the desegregation of the American South was the political externalization of the goal of the civil rights movement, but that the ultimate goal was the establishment of the beloved community. That's root cause. We must become a beloved community. And Dr. King said that in order for that to occur, we need external changes, quantitative changes in our circumstances, but also qualitative changes in our souls. He said that self-purification, this is a Gandhian principle, self-purification must precede political action. So if we are really to honor the tradition and the work of Dr. Martin Luther King today, we honor the fact that we have work to do ourselves, not just the external work, but also the internal work. Dr. King's stance of refusing to hate even those who hated him. His knowing that his capacity to forgive, his capacity to stand for love, no matter how much he was mocked, no matter how much he was humiliated. He said, it is time for a new dimension of love to be injected into the veins of human civilization. So we have work in our generation, and we must rise to the occasion as Dr. King and all of those who stood for the civil rights movement rose to the occasion in their time. And it is right and proper and fitting, isn't that how Lincoln described it? They all went to the battlefield at Gettysburg. It is right, it is proper, it is fitting that we remember today the sacrifices of other people. I've lived long enough that I remember when I was a little girl, growing up in Houston, Texas. I remember how my mother, we used to go to the doctors at the Medical Towers building in Houston. It's still there. And I remember the sign between the elevators, colored bathrooms downstairs. And I remember asking my mother, why does it say colored bathrooms downstairs? And I remember my mother explaining all that to me. with the Civil Rights Act, with the Supreme Court decision that helped dismantle segregation, science like that could no longer be here. That is why politics matters. That is why spirituality matters in terms of the changes that occur within us to make those external changes possible. So we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do on the outside. We have a lot of work to do on the inside. If you've ever been to the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, that is the place where Dr. King was assassinated. It is also now a museum in his honor. And you actually can go into the room, the hotel room, and then of course he was on the balcony when he was shot. Jesse Jackson and others who were there have told us that before he died, and we all know that he had a premonition. That's what that speech, I might not make it to the mountaintop with you, but I have seen, before he died, and I think the very hours, if not the hour before his death, he sat with his lieutenants on the bed and he said, okay, now let's go over again the principles of nonviolence. He didn't say let's go over strategy. Let's go over the principles of nonviolence. There is a wonderful book called Testament of Hope. It is his collected writings, his collected teachings. I highly recommend it. It's one of those books you just open anywhere, any of his speeches, because on top of everything else, he was so brilliant and such a brilliant writer and such a brilliant orator and such a courageous, courageous man. It is particularly, I remember when I got old enough to realize, my God, he was only 39 years old when he died. If you go into the Atlanta airport, they have one of his suits. They have in the Atlanta airport, of course, he had the Atlanta Ebenezer Baptist Church, which I had the honor of speaking at. Mrs. King gave me that great honor in 2002, I believe. If you're at the airport in Atlanta, they actually have an exhibit, and it includes one of his suits. He was a very short man. So those things, when I saw that, or when you think that he was 39 when he died, he was a human being. That's what you want to remember about someone like Dr. King. He went through so much. They bombed his house. They threatened him. They bombed that church where those little girls died. He knew that if they had not done that, that would not have happened. Read about him. Read Testament of Hope. Take it in. Get real with it. The deeper we go on days like today, the wider we can go in continuing the work that Dr. King and those like him began. And remember, their work was a continuation of work that came before them, abolition, etc. There has always been in the human heart the cry of justice, the yearning to be free. And that work continues, that work to take a stand. Remember when Dr. King gave his great I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial, he made a comment. Part of the speech was, we didn't come here to ask for new rights, we came here to cash a check. All men are created equal. That is our mission statement. That is the principle in our Declaration of Independence. And every generation is challenged. Do you or do you not mean that? Do you or do you not have the courage and the grit and the fierceness and the devotion to your descendants, as well as the honor to your grandparents and your ancestors, to stand on that and to make it safe and protected in your time, and to expand the franchise in your time, and to bequeath that principle actualized and embodied to your children as powerful as the way in which you found it, hopefully even better. That, to me, is the meaning of this day. And I know Stevie Wonder, I'm sure he on this day can feel some satisfaction knowing how much work he did to make it happen. There are others who did. Mrs. King, Coretta, has passed, but his children, her children, can be very proud of themselves and of their father and of their mother on this day. Let's remember that which remains. Dr. King was struck down in body, but those ideas can never be struck down as long as they are alive in us. God bless you, Martin. Thank you, Martin. Today, let's carry on the work. God bless.